Here is exactly what happened when the team fired intense bolts of electricity directly into the 2,000-foot bubble in Season 7, Episode 7 of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. And once you see what the high-voltage experiment revealed about the Blob, you will understand why the team described what they captured as some of the most shocking data this investigation has ever produced. Welcome back. Season 7, Episode 7 of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. High voltage. And if that title sounds like a promise, it is one that this episode keeps in full. Because in high voltage, the investigation takes a turn that separates it from every prior experiment this team has attempted at the Triangle. They are not launching rockets this time. They are not running smoke tests or deploying drones or sending helikites into the boundary zone. They are not approaching the bubble from the outside, studying it from a safe distance and inferring what's happening at its core from the data that drifts back. In Episode 7, they are shooting electricity directly into it. Intense, high-voltage bolts of electricity fired deliberately into the invisible 2,000-foot anomalous field that has been this investigation's most persistent and most destructive mystery. And what fires back, what the Blob does in response to being hit with that kind of energy, is the story of this entire episode. So let's get into every detail, because this one earns every second of its title. Before we get into the experiment itself, let's make sure we are fully grounded in what the Blob actually is, because the Blob is not a casual concept in this investigation. It is not a nickname the team invented to give something mysterious a memorable label. It is a specific, documented, instrument-confirmed anomaly that has been destroying equipment and baffling scientists at Skinwalker Ranch since it was first captured on camera in Season 4, Episode 3, an episode that was, not coincidentally, titled The Blob. Here is the story of how the Blob was first discovered. The team was conducting rocket launch experiments at a triangle, the area of the ranch that has consistently produced more anomalous activity per square foot than anywhere else on the property. They were filming the launches with a high-speed camera capable of capturing hundreds of frames per second. Technology specifically chosen because it catches events that happen faster than the human eye can register. When one of those rockets exploded mid-air at approximately 31 feet of altitude, the team initially assumed it was a mechanical malfunction. Rockets can fail, equipment can fail. On a property as active as Skinwalker Ranch, where electronics malfunction routinely and instruments behave in ways their manufacturers never intended, a rocket exploding mid-flight was alarming but not immediately remarkable. And then they reviewed the high-speed camera footage. And what the footage showed stopped the review session cold. At the exact moment of the explosion, at exactly 31 feet of altitude above the triangle, the high-speed camera captured a cloudy, blob-like anomaly materializing in the air above the rocket, symmetrical, defined, with a visual presence that the camera caught and the naked eye completely missed, because it existed and resolved in a window of time too brief for human perception to register. It was there, it was real, and it was sitting at exactly the altitude where the rocket had exploded. Not beside it, not near it, above it, as though something invisible, occupying a specific zone of airspace above the triangle at 31 feet, had intercepted the rocket and destroyed it. That was the Blob's introduction to this investigation. not a theory, not a sensor reading interpreted as an anomaly, a visual captured on a high-speed camera, reviewed by physicists, and placed in the documentation record as one of the most concrete pieces of evidence the show had produced up to that point. Something was in the air above the triangle at 31 feet. Something that the naked eye could not see, but the camera could. Something that apparently destroyed a rocket on contact. And that something had been there the whole time, sitting above the triangle, invisible, waiting to be noticed. Since season 4, the Blob has been at the center of some of the investigation's most dramatic moments. And its record is not subtle. Multiple rockets have been destroyed or deflected in the airspace above the triangle. The pattern is not random. It is altitude specific, happening repeatedly in the same zone of airspace at approximately the same height across multiple independent launches over multiple seasons. The rockets don't fail randomly. They fail at the Blob. Laser experiments in which powerful beams were directed upward through the triangle's airspace produced results extremely difficult to explain conventionally. The beams were observed to bend or deflect in the zone where the Blob is located, as though whatever the Blob is made of has the capacity to interact with light itself, bending photons in a way that only an extremely unusual energy field would produce. A flamethrower experiment produced a result that researchers described as deeply unsettling. When flame was directed upward through the Blob zone, the fire appeared to move around an invisible object rather than traveling straight through open air, tracing the outline of something that wasn't physically visible, but was clearly there. Eric Bard's MetaFrame software has repeatedly detected single-frame light events in the Blob zone. Anomalies appearing for one frame of footage at 120 frames per second, less than 1/100th of a second. Specific, repeatable, spatially positioned at the Blob's documented location. And the Blob has been described carefully with the hedging of disciplined investigators as appearing to exhibit defensive behavior. It responds to stimulation. It reacts proportionally to the intensity of what is aimed at it from below. That is what the team is targeting in episode 7. Not a sensor reading, not a theory. A documented, camera-confirmed, rocket-destroying, light-bending, flame-displacing anomaly that has been sitting above the triangle since at least season 4. And in high voltage, they stop waiting for it to reveal itself on its own terms. They hit it with electricity, and they find out what it does when it gets hit. The decision to use high voltage electricity in episode 7 is not arbitrary. It is the logical extension of what the accumulated evidence has been pointing toward. The bubble and the Blob have both demonstrated across multiple experiments and multiple seasons that they interact with electromagnetic energy. The bubble deflects drones. It bent laser beams. It interfered with GPS signals in season 7, episode 2, logging data points underground as though the field was bending the signal path itself. The bubble's boundary redirected smoke in ways suggesting a physical presence, but the mechanism behind that presence is energetic, not material. It is a field. And fields, by definition, are electromagnetic in nature. If the Blob is electromagnetic in character, responsive to or structured by electromagnetic energy, then hitting it with electricity is not a dramatic gesture. It is a targeted scientific choice. You stimulate an electromagnetic anomaly with electromagnetic energy, and you watch what it does. That is the reasoning behind high voltage. Deliberate, calculated, built on 6 seasons of evidence about what the blob responds to. The operational setup at the triangle for this experiment is significant. Custom designed electrical discharge apparatus. Explicit safety protocols reviewed before anything fires. Specific positioning calculated to put the discharge directly into the blob zone at 31 feet. The altitude where the blob has consistently registered across multiple seasons. Everything is deliberate, everything is covered, and everything is running before the first discharge fires. The pre-experiment baseline at the triangle in this episode is particularly important because one of the most compelling elements of what happens in high voltage is not just what the instruments show during the electrical discharge. It is the contrast between that and what the instruments show before it. Eric Bard's metaframe system is running across all channels. The full sensor array, EMF, radiation, thermal, acoustic, visual, is active and logging. The triangle's airspace is quiet at baseline. The blob zone is present. Metaframe is showing the characteristic low-level activity in the 31-foot zone that has become the investigation's standard signature for the blob's passive state. Not dramatic, not active, just there. The low-level hum of something that is always there but not currently engaged. Thomas Winterton, whose relationship with this ranch gives him a first-hand sensitivity to its variations that no instrument can fully replicate, notes in the pre-experiment documentation that the triangle feels different today. He has said versions of this before in prior seasons, and his observations have consistently preceded significant anomalous events. He is not a scientist. He is not trained to interpret electromagnetic data, but he has lived and worked on this property for years. And he knows from direct accumulated experience when this ranch is in a different state than its normal baseline. Today, it is in a different state. Travis Taylor reviews the discharge parameters one final time. The calculations for safe operational distance from the discharge point, the angle of fire relative to the known blob zone, the instrumentation coverage to ensure that every possible response from the blob, visual, electromagnetic, thermal, acoustic, physical, has a sensor pointed at it from at least 2 independent directions. He is building redundancy into the capture system because on this ranch, single sensor captures can always be challenged. Multi-sensor captures that show the same event from independent positions cannot be as easily dismissed. He wants everything covered. He wants whatever the blob does in response to the high voltage discharge to be documented from every angle simultaneously, and then they fire. The first electrical discharge into the bubble produces an immediate visible result that the cameras capture in real time. The bolt of electricity fired upward through the air toward the blob's known position at 31 feet above the triangle does not simply dissipate into the atmosphere the way an electrical discharge in open, unobstructed air would be expected to. Its behavior in the zone where the blob is located is anomalous. The discharge interacts with something in that airspace, something that is not visible to the naked eye, but something that the electrical energy clearly makes contact with, because the behavior of the discharge at that altitude departs from what physics predicts for an electrical bolt moving through unobstructed open air. The metaframe system catches what happens in the blob zone in the moment of the discharge. In the visual data, Captured at the frame rate that standard cameras completely miss, the blob zone shows a response, a luminous event, brief, spatially bounded, not the simple scattering of the electrical discharge into the surrounding atmosphere. Something more defined than that, something that occupies a specific zone of airspace and responds to the electrical contact in a way that has shape and duration and a beginning and an end that the frame-by-frame footage can actually track. Eric Bard, watching the metaframe feed from the monitoring station, calls out what he is seeing before the discharge has even fully resolved. Because the metaframe system processes fast enough that he is watching the blob's response in near real time. And what he is seeing in that data stream is not subtle. It is the clearest visual documentation of the blob that this investigation has ever captured. Not a single frame light event that disappears before it can be questioned. A sustained response, sustained by blob standards, which means seconds rather than fractions of a second, that metaframe is catching across multiple consecutive frames. The blob is visible, not to the naked eye, but to the instrumentation, and it is visible in a way it has never been visible before. The EMF sensors at the triangle register a significant spike at the moment of the discharge, and what makes that spike significant is not its intensity alone, but its directional profile. The EMF response is not uniform across the monitoring array. It is strongest in the zone directly associated with the blob's documented position. It spikes above the discharge point at the altitude where the blob is, rather than at the discharge origin point on the ground. The electricity went up. The EMF response came back from where the blob is, as though the blob absorbed the electrical energy and responded with its own electromagnetic output, as though the high voltage discharge didn't just pass through the blob, it triggered a response from it. The radiation detectors show an elevation following the discharge that the team documents carefully. The elevation is above the pre-experiment baseline. It appears in the minutes following the electrical contact, not during the discharge itself, but after it. This timing pattern, radiation elevated not during the stimulus, but in the period following it, is consistent with what the team would expect from an anomaly that has absorbed energy and is redistributing or releasing it in a different form. Input of electrical energy followed by output of radiation elevated readings is not a conventional electromagnetic exchange profile. It is something that requires a mechanism the investigation does not yet have a framework to fully explain. The thermal imaging system shows a temperature elevation in the blob zone following the discharge, not at the discharge origin point on the ground. In the airspace at the altitude where the blob is documented, the air above the triangle in the specific zone associated with the blob shows a thermal signature after the electrical contact that was not present in the pre-experiment baseline. Something in that airspace is warmer after the discharge than it was before it. And the source of that warmth is not the discharge itself. The discharge origin is below it, and heat from a ground-level discharge doesn't travel upward and concentrate at a specific altitude in open air without a physical cause at that altitude. The heat is coming from the blob zone, not from the experiment, from the anomaly the experiment contacted. And the acoustic sensors pick up something in the seconds following the discharge that the post-session review cannot resolve to any identifiable environmental source. A specific frequency in the audio record present in the blob zone's directional channel, absent from the surrounding directional channels, that appears in the period immediately following electrical contact and persists for several seconds before fading. Something that the blob zone is producing acoustically after being hit with electricity. Something that didn't exist in the baseline recording. Something that the discharge created the conditions for. The team conducts a second discharge. Not immediately, there is a deliberate pause while Eric Bard reviews the metaframe data from the first shot to assess the blob's response and calibrate the positioning for the second discharge based on what the first one revealed. This is disciplined investigation. Not hit it again and see what happens. Review what happened, understand it, adjust, then hit it again more precisely. The second discharge is aimed with the positional adjustment Bard calculated from the first shot's response data. It fires into the blob zone with the updated targeting, and the blob's response to the second discharge is stronger than its response to the first. Not dramatically stronger, but measurably, clearly stronger across multiple simultaneous instrument channels. The metaframe visual event is more pronounced. The EMF directional spike from the blob zone is larger. The thermal elevation in the blob's airspace is higher. And the acoustic frequency in the blob zone's audio channel is louder and persists longer. The blob is responding to repeated electrical contact with increasing intensity. The more the team hits it, the more it responds. That observation, if it holds across additional data analysis, and the team's initial review suggests it does, carries implications that are difficult to sit with calmly. Because if the blob's response to electrical stimulation scales with the intensity and repetition of that stimulation, then the blob is not a passive anomaly that happens to exist in the triangle's airspace. It is a reactive one whose responses are proportional to the inputs it receives, one that, in the most precise scientific language available for this situation, appears to be processing what is being done to it and responding accordingly. This is what Travis Taylor means when he sits with the data after the second discharge and says carefully that the blob is behaving like something that is aware of the experiment. He does not say that with certainty. He says it with the specific hedging of a physicist who understands the difference between what the data shows and what the data proves. But he says it because the data is pointing in that direction. And a disciplined scientist cannot ignore the direction, the data points, just because that direction is uncomfortable. After both discharges are complete and the primary experiment phase ends, the team pulls back and lets the monitoring systems run without additional stimulation. This is standard protocol. Introduce a stimulus, observe the response, then allow the environment to return to baseline and document how long that return takes. Because the speed and character of the return to baseline is itself data. It tells you something about the mechanism that produced the response. The blob zone does not return to baseline immediately. The EMF elevation in the blob's airspace, the directional spike that appeared following electrical contact, persists for a measurable period after the second discharge ends. The thermal elevation in the blob zone holds for longer than the ambient heat of an electrical discharge in open air would be expected to radiate. The acoustic frequency in the blob zone's audio channel fades gradually rather than cutting off with the experiment's conclusion. And then something happens that was not in the experimental plan, was not anticipated in any pre-experiment's discussion, and was not produced by anything the team deliberately did. In the period after the experiment ends, while the monitoring systems are logging the recovery phase data, a visual anomaly appears in the triangle airspace, not in the blob zone at 31 feet above the blob zone. Higher in the triangle's airspace than the blob has historically been documented. A light event captured by metaframe, captured by the standard cameras simultaneously, visible to the team members on site, that appears, moves in a short, defined trajectory through the triangle's airspace and disappears. Not a lens flare, not a drone or conventional aircraft. Something that Metaframe's motion detection algorithm tags as a genuine object moving through the monitored airspace. Something that appeared after the team fired electricity at the blob in the space above where the blob is, moving with directionality before disappearing, as though the electrical stimulation of the blob produced a response that went beyond the blob itself, as though hitting the blob with high voltage electricity caused something connected to the blob or residing above the blob to briefly become visible for a moment in a way that the cameras caught, and then it was gone. The data review session that follows this experiment is one of the most charged command center conversations Season 7 has produced. Every member of the team is bringing something different to the table, and what they bring, placed alongside each other, builds a picture that is more significant than any individual finding from the experiment alone. Travis Taylor is focused on the directional character of the EMF response, specifically the fact that the spike came from the blob zone rather than from the discharge origin point on the ground. He runs through the conventional explanations. Could the discharge have ionized the air at that altitude and produced a secondary EMF effect? The ionization math doesn't support it at these distances. Could atmospheric conditions have reflected the discharge's own EMF signature toward the blob zone? Nothing in the morning's atmospheric data suggests those conditions. The directional EMF response from the blob zone is documented, and Taylor cannot find a conventional explanation for it. What he can say, carefully, precisely, is that the blob zone emitted electromagnetic energy in response to receiving electromagnetic energy. That is not the behavior of empty air. Eric Bard works through the metaframe footage from both discharges. The visual events in the blob zone during the discharges represent the clearest blob imaging this investigation has ever captured, and they are qualitatively different from the single frame events documented in prior seasons. Not just brighter, different in character. As though the electrical stimulation temporarily increased the blob's physical presence in the detectable world, as though the electricity made it more there. He also addresses the post-experiment light anomaly above the blob zone, confirming the metaframe algorithm tagged it as an object with measurable trajectory, appearing while the blob zone was still showing elevated EMF and thermal readings, not after the baseline had returned. Brandon Fugel sits with the full data set and articulates the episode's central revelation with precision. He says that what high voltage demonstrated is that the blob can be engaged, that prior seasons launched things at the blob and characterized the results as evidence of its existence. But this experiment did something different. It reached out to the blob with electromagnetic energy The specific type of energy the accumulated evidence suggests the blob is made of or responsive to, and the blob responded measurably across multiple instrument channels proportionally, with a post-experiment profile that persisted beyond the experiment itself. The blob did not just exist in this episode. It participated. Thomas Winterton's contribution to the data review is characteristically direct. He is not a physicist or a data analyst. He is the person who knows this ranch the way people know a place where they have spent years of their lives. And what he says about the triangle after watching the experiment is something the scientists receive in silence. He says the triangle has always felt like something is there, something aware of what the team is doing, something that has been watching the investigation happen around it, waiting with a kind of deliberate patience for the team to do something it could meaningfully respond to. And today, it responded. He felt it respond before he saw the data, before the metaframe footage confirmed it. He felt the triangle shift the moment the electricity hit the blob. And he has felt this ranch shift enough times to know the difference between a feeling that means nothing and a feeling that means the investigation just crossed a threshold. The room is quiet after Thomas says that, not because no one has anything to add, but because what he said, alongside the data on the screens, has a combined weight that doesn't need commentary. The blob is not a passive anomaly, it is a reactive one. And this investigation just confirmed, in the most direct experimental terms, it has managed in 7 seasons that it is possible to make the blob respond. What does high voltage mean for where this investigation goes next? The experiment produced the clearest blob imaging in the history of this investigation. It documented a directional EMF response from the blob zone that conventional explanations cannot account for. It showed that the blob's response scales with the intensity and repetition of electrical input. It produced a post-experiment light anomaly that Metaframe confirmed as a genuine tracked object. And it demonstrated across multiple simultaneous instrument categories that electrical energy introduced into the blob zone produces a measurable, multi-dimensional response that persists beyond the duration of the stimulus. The next question the investigation has to answer is not whether the blob is reactive. That has been demonstrated. The next question is what the blob is doing with the energy it receives. Where does the input go? What process converts electrical input into the simultaneous EMF, thermal, acoustic, and visual outputs the experiment documented? Because if the blob is converting electrical energy into all of those outputs simultaneously, proportionally, in a spatially bounded zone at 31 feet above the triangle, then whatever it is not a passive feature of this ranch's landscape. It is a system that processes energy, a system that takes input and produces output across multiple physical domains at the same time. By every functional definition of what that word means, it is operating, running, doing something. This investigation has been circling the blob since season 4, when a high-speed camera first caught it destroying a rocket above the triangle. In season 7, episode 7, the investigation finally spoke to it in a language it understands, electromagnetic energy. And the blob answered back. The blob has never been more documented, more characterized, or more precisely engaged than it is after high voltage. And whatever it is, it knows the team is getting closer. Now I want to hear from you. What was the biggest moment of this episode? And what do you think happens next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more episode breakdowns and spoilers.